Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources to hopefully help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with my co-host Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest, Shea Swauger. He's a department head researcher at Aurora Library, Colorado State University. There, Shea's role is to connect people with the resources, spaces, services, and technology that will help them with their research. Shea has a Master's of Library Science from the University of North Carolina and a BA degree in philosophy from the University of Colorado. And most recently, something we're going to get into during the show, Shea published a paper, Software that Monitors Students During Tests, Perpetuates Inequality and Violates Their Privacy. MIT Technology Review just this past August 7th. Shea Swauger, welcome to Community and Technology.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you here. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Shea. I read your bio and gave your credentials, but tell us a little bit about your background. I looked at your curriculum vitae, and for a young guy, a person, you have an incredible amount of work published. I'm very impressive. So tell us about how you got to be where you are and what you're about.
Thank you. So I'm a librarian. So my day-to-day work is, well, now it's not in a library, it's working remote, like a lot of people. But I work on a campus that serves a community college and 2 universities. And I became interested in technology pretty early on. But my background was more like philosophy and critical theory. And I started applying the things that I had learned and the things we were reading in classes to conversations that we've been having professionally as librarians with technology and specifically with privacy. And it's funny, most of the work that I do in terms of writing, at least, and a lot of speaking, is because I see something that makes me very angry. And there's a lot. There's plenty of resources in the world to motivate like an outrage response. Oh, what's up, Dave?
Hey, you're back.
Yay.
Okay. Shea was just telling us a little bit about his background, Dave, and how he came to be the person that he is. Go ahead, Shea.
So instead of just getting mad at things that I felt were unjust in the world, it became almost a catharsis to write about it. And as I started writing things, other people were like, oh yeah, that's something that we should address or look at or work on or not do. And that's motivated me to do more of that. And so most of my work is largely a response to some kind of injustice that I see that has some combination of technology or education. It's informed by my profession as a librarian, but it's not always about librarianship. So in this case, it's about technology and surveillance around cheating.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about that. And just I know for some of us, it's been a while since we've been in the classroom. And I know it's been a while since I've been proctored. It's been quite a while. Tell us a little bit of what is proctoring and tell us a little bit about that process.
Yeah, so like proctoring as a practice in education has been around for a very long time. So if you've ever taken a test as a student, like this happens in K-12 environments, there's sort of like a supervision, someone that is watching to make sure that there isn't cheating happening. And that can happen in person, that can happen online. So a proctor can be a person, or in this case, it can also be a software. So in general in education, there's a lot of people that care deeply about something called academic integrity or the lack of cheating, that we're being honest in our assessments of learning. There's a lot of embedded problems with academic integrity language, and we can get into that. But nonetheless, online education started becoming something that universities and colleges maybe 15, 20 years ago, started exploring how could we teach students online. So they started offering programs and degrees that you could achieve almost entirely online. And so we started translating testing from a classroom space that was controlled by people to an online space that was often asynchronous and in people's houses and done all over the world. And so that question of academic integrity kind of followed to an online space of, if I give my students a test online and I want them to not use any sort of information aids, or they don't want to use their best friends to help them on the answers, how do I make sure that these students are not cheating? And so Proctor companies started offering the service of, very much like what you and I are doing right now, is if I was taking a test and you were the proctor, you would literally watch me take a test, and you would have access to my screen and to my microphone, and you would actually see the screen that I have. And so it's kind of like a one-to-one relationship of one human proctor, kind of like in a call center environment, to one student taking a test. And then a few years ago, it depends on the company in terms of the time frame, they started developing machine learning algorithms in combination with some biometric technologies and packaging them as a software suite that, instead of a person watching one-to-one, it was a software watching one software to many students. So you could scale up this proctoring environment. And so all of us could be taking the test, and a software can watch us, quote unquote. And that's what the general idea of a software proctor is.
Mm-hmm. And as you have looked at this and studied this, you have started to see and identify some built-in bias to this proctoring process. We've had a number of shows here on Community and Technology where we talked about AI and so many of the built-in biases that are built in by the folks that build them. And I guess we should not be surprised to see that in the proctoring environment. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Yeah. So first of all, I really appreciate that you're having those conversations. That is incredibly needed in technology circles, is this acknowledgement, even almost an admission that technology isn't neutral, that it's not objective, and even data and math isn't neutral or objective. And there's incredible work from really significant scholars out there that are debunking this idea, but it's still not widely accepted within the tech community that's making the products and making a lot of money on them, that there's a bias. And more than bias, I would actually say we're embedding oppressive principles of racism, white supremacy, sexism that get reproduced in this. But specifically for proctoring, a lot of proctoring companies use facial recognition. Not all of them, but most of them. And the ones that don't use something called facial detection. And that is a specific technology that has a long history of white supremacy. And it is not only, I'm a white cis male, so it's going to identify and read me very well. It's not a coincidence that most of the developers of these technologies are white cis males. And so they typically test it on themselves and user groups that look like them. So we see that the accuracy rates for these technologies, for me, would be fine, like in the high 90s% in terms of identification. As you start changing demographics, you see the accuracy rates go down. So I'm not sure about the rankings, but it's something similar to, white cis men, black cis men, white cis women, black cis women. And then if you're transgender or non-binary, the accuracy rates drop significantly, almost to random. Wow. And so, and I want to say that facial recognition as a technology is not something that I think is reformable. It's not something that I think that if we just had accuracy at 100% across the board, I would still say it's a bad technology in terms of privacy. But what that means in terms of accuracy rates is that the software proctoring needs to validate that the student that's taking the test, if I'm trying to take the test, that I am Shea Swauger that's logged into the course. And what we've seen is that students who are trying to validate their identities to get into a test, that if you're Black or if you're trans or non-binary, you have a much harder time getting validated. And oftentimes it won't recognize you. And that can send some really damaging messages of that, like, higher education wasn't made for you. Like, we literally didn't build it with you in mind. We build it for me in mind. And that's a pretty insidious message, not only because a lot of higher education in general was not built for everyone, but we're literally encoding it in the software that the students are experiencing every day.
And right now you're talking about just signing in, being identified as a student. We haven't even gotten into the ongoing process. Let me just say, we're listening to, I should say you're listening to WHCR 90.3 FM, the Voice Harlem. And we have a very special guest today, Shea Swauger, who's talking about built-in bias in remote testing. So, Shea, you were saying that just the whole sign-in process as a student often discriminates against Black and brown and trans and non-binary folks just by not recognizing them with their facial recognition technology, AI technology. Once you're able to sign in, what are some of the other biases that you've been able to identify?
A few. I wish it got better after the sign-in. That's just kind of the first hurdle. So you can see I'm in my office. I am privileged enough to have sort of a space dedicated to having a conversation like this. A lot of remote programs, by I mean educational programs, when people are taking tests, it's usually students that are taking tests maybe in their bedroom, sometimes at their kitchen table. They don't always have a lot of control over the setting that they're taking their test in. And so some of the software settings that will try to flag what is suspicious behavior of cheating are things like loud noises. So if you are a parent and you have a child running around, or if you have a pet running around, that you'll get these like false positives of cheating behavior. It'll raise your suspicion score. And we know that in general, women are more often responsible for things like childcare or caretaking a family. And so if we know that people are taking tests at home, and we know that children are going to raise false suspicion, women are going to be impacted more than men. If you have a medical condition where you need to use the restroom frequently, or you need to administer medication, so leaving the screen of the camera like this, that now raises my suspicion level for cheating. Also, if you have, if you look away from the screen, so there's some technologies called gaze estimation, like it'll track where my eye moves across the screen. That will raise my suspicion level, but there are definitely conditions in which people are less likely to make eye contact with the screen. And so it's sort of normalizing what a body is and should be. And if you don't fit inside of that definition of normal, it automatically perceives you as a threat. And like I would say, historically, we've been doing this forever. This is not new. Technology has kind of wrapped this process of education and exclusion of othering in a shiny new package. But and by we, I mean education. Anytime someone who hasn't been allowed inside the bounds of education tries to get in, be that women or people of color or people with disabilities, we have typically othered them and said that they are not trustworthy or that they're disruptive. And now we can do that with technology. We almost can outsource our prejudicial judgments and almost absolve ourselves of any moral guilt we feel because of this belief in the myth of technological neutrality. And so if we ever get called on it, it's like, it's not me, it's just the math, it's software that's being discriminatory, not me. But all the things that we see historically in terms of exclusion of or othering of people that don't look like me, this technology does it very effectively.
Wow. Wow, that's incredible. It's really interesting to hear you frame it in that the technology really is just formalizing stuff that's been going on institutionally, forever, if you will. But as you said, puts it in a shiny package. It formalizes it. It's got mathematics applied to it and quote unquote algorithms. So somehow the computer is figuring out. So if there's an error, it's not human error, it's computer error. So somehow, as you say, that absolves the institution of any real responsibility, really, for the discrimination. So talk a little bit, Shea, if you can, about just how much this proctoring technology has really increased, and this activity has increased since the pandemic.
Oh my gosh. Oh, absolutely. So since COVID-19 has caused so many institutions to go to remote education, there's been a scramble for institutions to figure out how to make that transition to online. And there's maybe, I don't know, 6, 8 companies that are some of the largest ones when it comes to online proctoring. Every story that I read about their business is that it's booming. Like, they have increased their customer base significantly. And they're making a lot of money. So there's a term around trying to take advantage of a crisis or a pandemic. I think it's called disaster capitalism. And these are for-profit companies. Their main goal is to make a profit. And a pandemic is really good for their business right now. And sometimes these universities that are feeling desperate and overwhelmed, trying to figure out a solution, will adopt a technology perhaps more uncritically than they should, because I feel like it's going to offer them a solution to a really complex problem of, how do you teach online effectively? Assessment in general of learning is a complex problem. So how do you do meaningful, authentic assessments in an online space to, teachers who've maybe never taught online and this is their first time, and maybe to students who have never learned online and this is their first time. And these companies are really good at marketing. Like, it's one of the things that I think they do really well is playing to some of the academic fears around academic integrity, such as like plagiarism, fabrication, falsification, maybe hyping up a lot of the danger or the threat. Tying it to money is a big one. So in these marketing campaigns, the companies will often say that your brand as an institution is on the line. And if students in your institution are cheating, then everyone will know that a degree or a certificate from your institution doesn't mean anything. And if that gets out, then no one's going to want to come to your school, and then you're going to have financial collapse and you'll be irrelevant. And they don't say it exactly like that, but that's the implication of their marketing.
That's the message.
And it's effective. Like, if you're a school administrator, and in the US, we've been defunding higher education for decades, and so it's almost all tuition based. And so there's a huge financial incentive to get students in the door. So a company that says this will get students in the door and keep them coming, and it will, make sure that this online move that you've done is going to, look kind of like it did when it was in person. There's a relief of, oh, okay, yes, please take my money. I will adopt this product, even if there's discrimination tied into it, if they ever even hear about it, which in general, most of them don't.
Wow, that's incredible. Shea, talk a little bit, I know in your paper, you talked about some subtle things that, to the layperson, if you're not really examining what's going on, it might not occur to you, but talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that folks that may have certain disabilities or other challenges, how the software discriminates against them. Some of it's kind of subtle. It's not necessarily obvious if you haven't studied it. Talk a little bit about that if you would.
Sure. Before we do that, let's back up a little bit to how the technology works to frame it.
Okay.
So you can see my body right now. So you can see like my shoulders, my head. And if you were to take machine learning and computer vision and sort of overlay that, it will have a definition of what normal is. And it's going to have like maybe a bell curve of these are the kind of normal movements, the sounds that I'm making, the gestures that I have. And then if you run thousands and thousands of people, of Zoom meetings perhaps, through that, it's going to have a kind of baseline of what acceptable normal behavior is. And then these proctoring software companies are trying to say, all right, what are cheating behaviors? What does it look like when someone cheats? And so they actually hire people to try and cheat the system. And then they run it through classes where there's been students that they've know that are cheating, and they try to identify what that behavior looks like. And so they frame that as maybe abnormal or suspicious behavior. And so some examples of behavior that is totally fine, it's not cheating, but would be flagged as suspicious, can broadly be categorized as like stemming. So stemming is short for like stimulation, and we all do some version of this. You might bite your nails, or play with your hair. I often like move my glasses up my face as kind of like a tick. If you tapped on the desk before, that's stemming behavior. That will often flag you, and everyone does this. Everyone will be generally affected. If you have ADHD or autism, your stemming behavior looks different than most people's stemming behavior. So perhaps rocking back and forth, pulling on your hair, or saying particular words out loud, or humming. Stemming behavior looks different per person, but a software doesn't know what your normal stemming behavior is, and it doesn't have a category for ADHD or autistic. And even across those identities, there's a spectrum of what that stemming behavior looks like. It has nothing to do with cheating, none whatsoever. But the software will pick up behaviors that are completely normal. But because it's not in its algorithm of its normal curve, it will more likely flag someone with autism or ADHD as attempting to cheat. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to fail the test. What it does mean is that if you're the teacher and you have students that are being flagged for suspicious behavior, you're going to get this like suspicion report. And it's actually, depending on the product, it's color-coded levels of suspicion. And so you'll see these, red categories of students. And that's already problematic in that it influences how you adjudicate who's cheating and who isn't. It's not giving the professor or the teacher an objective look into cheating behavior. It's saying, this is what our algorithm thinks. And then it prompts the teacher to watch the flagged sections on a timetable. And so if they have students that are consistently scoring as high suspicion, that can absolutely influence how they grade their assessment, how they grade the tests. And if they actually pass their students on to academic integrity, misconduct processes and procedures, and some of them are really aggressive and invasive. Going back to some of the authentication, if a student is trans or non-binary, there's historically been a lot of trauma around validating your identity. And IDs are a really hard thing to get, depending on the state you're living in. So if a software is flagging trans or non-binary students, and then the professor is then prompted to go and review this, that student may not have disclosed their trans or non-binary identity to the professor. So in a sense, this software can out trans and non-binary students to professors that they may not wish to know and who actually might not be safe to know. And depending on the college or the university you're going to, so there are definitely religious universities that have suspended, expelled, and revoked financial aid to trans and non-binary students because it's come out. And so this presents not just like a theoretical or abstract threat. This can actually put people's financial and physical well-being in danger.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. We're listening to Shea Swauger, who's talking about bias in automated proctoring of online learning. This is WACR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Dave, why don't you come into the conversation? Do you have any comments or questions for Shea? Dave, are you there? I think Dave may be.
I'm sorry.
Dave, come in, Dave. Come in, Dave. Just trying to bring you into the conversation with Shea, Dave. Okay, well, I don't know if we have Dave's audio or not. Dave, are you there? Dave, we can't hear you. Okay, well, whenever you're able to join us, Dave, just jump right in, okay? You know you don't need an introduction. So we're talking to Shea Swauger about AI and proctoring. Shea, well, one of the questions I had is, do some of these same companies do the evaluation of the performance as well as the proctoring, or are they're just looking for cheating and that's it?
That's a good question. I haven't seen a ton of evaluation in a meaningful sense, as in like a third party come in and do a comprehensive review of the effectiveness. There's been a couple of peer-reviewed studies around whether or not these companies are effective, but even those methodologically, they're not measuring cheating. They're sort of measuring approximations of it. So as an industry, there's not a ton of evidence that these companies actually are good at what they say they are good at. And in general, I'm suspicious of any institution that says that they're data-driven. But that's a thing that a lot of universities and colleges like to say about themselves, that we make our decisions based on evidence and data. But that means that they're not applying that same value to how they're licensing these technologies, because there isn't a robust set of data that says test proctoring is effective at catching cheating. And I think that that's important, because if there's already this massive movement towards adopting this, but there's not a lot of evidence for doing it, we must be doing it for some other reason. And I think the reason is discriminatory exclusion, that higher education and education in general is already predisposed to distrust students, and to distrust students who don't look like most of the students that have graduated from education in the last 200 years. And by that I mean white, male, wealthy, cis, heterosexual. So education, we've been letting very slowly, way too slowly, more people to join what it means to get an education, or at least a public education. But every time we do that, we see very significant resistance and pushback and distrust. And so I think that these companies have a natural affinity, or maybe universities have a natural affinity towards products that cater to that mistrust. Because we're not doing it based on evidence. We're doing it based on it's already aligning to implicit value systems of exclusion and discrimination.
Wow. That's a powerful statement, Jay. I certainly have observed that myself. So I mean, what you're saying resonates with a lot of my experience in education. One of the papers that I saw in your Reid talked about never neutral data. That's something I'd like you to talk about. I'm involved in journalism and reporting, and one of my pet peeves is that there's never a neutral reporting. There's
Mhm.
never a neutral storytelling. It's impossible. Everyone has a point of view coming from someplace. So, what's your take on never neutral data? Talk about.
Yeah. So data in general is something that a lot of people like to think is objective or neutral.
Mhm.
And that's a philosophical position to say something is neutral or not neutral. We're getting into my undergraduate, which I love, um, but I think that that's not a very supportable position to say that there is either something objective that we can use to understand either each other or reality. So that's almost like an epistemological stance that I have to start with to engage in any conversation about technology. I tend to gravitate towards critical theory and approaches that try to understand something like data through lenses of power and who has it, who benefits from certain framings of something like data. And so I think that data and technology have largely been used to accumulate and sustain power. So who has access to data, who gets to call something data and define what that means and how they use it. And in technology, I think that expresses itself through things like white supremacy and sexism. So the people who get to participate in technology are usually white men. And we see some changes here and there, but Silicon Valley in general, it's a dude fest. And it's been like that for a really long time. And we see, these stats and reports from, giants like Facebook, and they haven't really moved the needle on trying to be inclusive. But they're also the ones deciding, what is objective and what is neutral. And I'm using big scare quotes on that.
Mhm.
But I come to conversations about data and technology and neutrality with this stance that data is not objective. It was defined by a certain group of people for a particular purpose in a particular context with ends in mind. And you can't erase that. It's not a metaphysical window into reality. It's a subjective encapsulation of a particular context. And I don't want to get too abstract, but I think data actually says more about the people that are making it than it actually says anything about reality.
It was just a little concrete example. I get where you're coming from, but for some folks that maybe haven't looked at this issue, just give us just a
Yeah.
example.
No, thank you. Let's make it real. All right. So I believe in GenBank. GenBank is a DNA sequence. I think it's next gen sequencing. I'm not positive. Essentially, it's a genetic database. I think researchers from all across the US and I think the world can deposit genetic sequence data into GenBank. It's often used in medicine. The National Institute of Health is involved with it, I think, in some way. And it's one of the largest groupings of genetic data that we have access to. So it means it's a huge resource. It's let's ask questions about genetics, and if we have a study design that we want to test a new pharmacology method on certain gene sequence data, GenBank is a really good place to go.
Mm-hmm.
However, the data in GenBank is not representative of everyone in the United States. How the data got collected was largely from volunteer study groups of people that had both the time and inclination to participate in a medical study. And for lots of very legitimate reasons, poor people and people of color have experienced medical trauma and have a healthy distrust of certain kinds of studies. I mean, it goes back, to
Tuskegee.
yeah, Tuskegee. I mean, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. There's a book called Medical Apartheid that I think is really excellent, that goes into sort of the abuse of medical experimentation. So there's lots of reasons why participation is what it is, but that means that GenBank is mostly white people, and it's mostly people in certain areas. So it's not a representative sample of the genetic makeup of the United States. And so when pharmacy companies are trying to develop new drugs, and the only resource they have that's going to be at the scale that GenBank is, to try to develop something that is effective, it's going to be effective for white people. It's going to be targeted for white people. And this is not necessarily because pharmacy companies were trying to be discriminatory, although they definitely do that in other ways. It is this idea that GenBank was objective. And it was because of social and systemic abuses of power that created GenBank to skew very, very white. And the consequences of that is a further disparity in health outcomes by anything that's used on GenBank to develop maybe a new product. And so it's racism in, racism out. But GenBank itself is just a set of data. And so people would often look at GenBank and be like, well, it's just data. The data itself can't be racist. I don't understand how you could get a racist interpretation of genetic data. Like, that's the most objective form of medical experimentation. And yet we see racism in and racism out very clearly. And so it depends on what kind of frame and lens you're looking at data in. And when you look at it through a critical theory lens, I think it makes a lot of sense that racism and white supremacy influence the collection of data, who has it, how it's used, and who benefits from it. And across the board, it's mostly wealthy white people that created it, stored it, and benefit from its current manifestation.
Thank you for that clarification and example. This is WHCR 90.3, Community and Technology. We're speaking with Shea Swauger about data, AI, and implicit biases in education and testing. And one area I wanted you to talk a little bit about, I note that you also did a paper on prison to school pipeline in education and tech education. Can you talk a little bit about that? We got about 10 minutes left in the show, so if you can kind of give us your take on that and from your perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. Could talk all day about that, but we'll do 10 minutes for sure.
Okay.
So the product we were talking about earlier, the proctoring product, that is in an industry generally called ed tech, or educational technology. And I think there's a pretty strong trend in the ed tech community to borrow values and technology from things like the police and prisons. So there's something called the school to prison pipeline, which people have been writing about for decades. And that's the practice and policy of pushing low income and usually students of color from K-12 education or even in higher ed into prison systems. Well documented, horrifying, tragic, still exists, still operating. What I think is happening in the ed tech space is almost this reverse of we're pushing students into the prison system, but we're also pushing technology from the prison system into education. Mm. And that looks like adoptions of technologies that are really effective in law enforcement or in corrections, and using it on students. So this goes back into we don't trust students, and the way to control students who we don't trust is to surveil them. to track them and even predict what they're going to do, either academically, socially, or politically. And so we've been adopting in higher education and K-12 lots of technologies that were first piloted in criminal justice. So, for example, there's things like Predpol or CompStat or Palantir. These are crime prediction algorithms. They use a technology called predictive analytics. And we've been trying to predict either where crime is going to happen before it happens, who is going to become a criminal, and when crime is going to happen. So there's usually 3 different strategies. There's an excellent book called The Rise of Big Data Policing. I think it's Ferguson, and Andrew Guthrie Ferguson, I think, wrote that. But those technologies, they're terrible, they're racist, they're classist, they are all kinds of wrong. But education was like, that looks wonderful. Let's do that in our schools. And so we do that with advising. So if we're trying to make sure, because of our funding structures, the way we make money is to get students who can afford to pay our tuition to come in. So we don't want anyone that will default. We will want to make sure that they can graduate. And we don't really want to change what we're doing to make sure that we're accessible and that we're able to support all kinds of students. Let's just selectively target the ones we think that are most likely to come in. And so they'll look at, things that are risk factors associated with students. So your zip code becomes a risk factor, which is also proxy for your race or your class. And we'll notice that certain zip codes, we're going to be sending more marketing materials to them. Or we'll look at like demographic risk factors. So we said, earlier that Silicon Valley has been participating in white supremacy and sexism that comes from like also the pipeline of education. So like STEM programs. So let's say computer science or physics. They do terrible when it comes to supporting like women generally, and especially women of color. And so if you're a Black woman and you're trying to become a physics major, but historically, very few, if any, Black women have ever graduated from your program, a predictive analytics software will look at a Black woman student in her freshman year and classify her Blackness and her womanness as now risks. And it will advise her into something that she might be more successful in statistically, because the university has been more successfully graduating Black women in, say, sociology. And so it is perpetuating both racism and sexism through predictive analytics, but it was first trialed and adopted in criminal justice. So the police sort of refined its racism, and then software companies found a new market in higher education. So that's what I call the prison to school pipeline. And so it is both prediction, it's control, it's surveillance. It's a lot of different aspects, but it is a terrifying development in educational technology.
Wow. This is the first I've heard of this, Shea. I mean, I don't suppose, maybe you did invent this, but are you the first one to talk about this? Why?
Oh, no.
Why? Is there a broader conversation about this?
Yeah, fortunately there is.
Get our listeners and viewers to some places to maybe learn some more about this.
Absolutely. So there's, not surprisingly, it's mostly women. It's mostly Black women that are running the conversation. So I'd point, let's see, definitely Dr. Safiya Noble. She wrote a book called Algorithms of Oppression. I would highly recommend. Dr. Benjamin Ruha, Dr. Ruha Benjamin. Oh, she can't hear this interview then if I said her name wrong. She's a scholar out of Princeton, African American Studies. She wrote a book called Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools in the New Jim Crow, which is excellent. So I would start with those two, and that helps grounding, understanding technology and data in a way that engages aspects of power and race. But also when you apply to education, the same tenets hold true.
Wow. I mean, we've heard so much about school to prison pipeline. but to hear you talk about prison to school in terms of technology, that's startling.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think fundamentally it's not going to go away. It will change over time. And the landscape now will look different in 5 or 10 years. But I've stopped almost going to, library conferences or events or education conferences or events. And I almost exclusively go to police or jail conferences.
Really?
Yeah, because they have, so the International Association for Chiefs of Police, I'm now a member, which I feel very conflicted about. But they have a technology conference, and that I think is a better window into the future of ed tech than anything universities are saying. And the jails and correctional facilities also, they've been doing surveillance and control for a lot longer than universities have. And so they're on the cutting edge in a really terrible way. And so it helps me understand where I think education is going in terms of surveillance and prediction.
Wow, that is truly stunning, Shea. That's stunning. We just got a couple of minutes left. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the whole library scheme. I know you've written about privacy and surveillance in the library system. We just got a couple of minutes. Maybe you can give us a little highlight about what's going on there.
Yeah, so libraries very much care about privacy, or at least we should. And there's lots of reasons to, in terms of, there's a history of the state usually coming in after 9/11 and the Patriot Act and the search for terrorists. There was a lot of push to release library records of anyone that was checking out, say, a Quran. And libraries were like, hell no, we're not doing that. We're going to delete all of our patron records. So we're now in a place where contact tracing for COVID is going to be a standard protocol. And so professionally, I know our library and other libraries are wrestling with how do we protect patron privacy in terms of either visiting our library if we're also trying to facilitate contact tracing if someone tests positive for COVID. And so we're balancing a really nebulous and complicated value system of we want to like promote public health and make sure people are aware of if they have been exposed. But we also want to protect patron privacy. And if you've ever used a library, like that's in like our top 10 core values in the ALA Code of Ethics is patron privacy. And so when they come into conflict, how can we resolve something that both promotes public health, but also patron privacy? And that's really complicated. And honestly, I don't know if we have answers yet.
Wow. And that's a whole nother area, contact tracing and privacy. I don't know that we have time to go into it today, but maybe you'll be back and talk to us about that another time.
That'd be fun. I'd love to come back.
Okay. Is there anything you want to just kind of mention as we wrap up here that maybe I didn't bring up?
Yeah. Lastly, the best thing to do in higher education is trust your students. If you are a student, advocate for yourself. Testing doesn't have to look like this. Education doesn't have to look like this. Technology and data in general don't have to look like this. We get to choose what it's going to be. And we don't have to choose surveillance. We don't have to choose white supremacy. We don't have to choose sexism. We can imagine and build something much better than it is. And I don't want people to walk away feeling discouraged that it's never going to change, because I really do believe that we have the ability to build something better.
Wow. Well, thank you, Shea Swauger. We've been speaking with Shea Swauger. He's in the library system at the University of Colorado in Denver. And I want to thank you for coming on Community and Technology. You've been a real insightful breath of fresh air. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, hope to have you back again soon. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Out on my way